Yeah, welcome everybody. Can I talk about some guilty pleasure reads with some of the authors here today? My name is Danielle Erickson. I'm one of the committee members with the festival, so it's been fun to kind of see the behind the scenes and the planning and everything that way. So I think to get started, we'll just kind of go around the group, and if you just kind of give a real quick intro, who you are, maybe just kind of the types of books that you write at this point. And then we'll just kind of take it from there. So we'll just kind of go around the room kind of as I see you on my screen. And so yeah, Susan, if you want to get us started.
All right, I'm Susan Stradiotto. I am a fantasy author, a romance author, and a freelance editor. And I am from Eden Prairie, Minnesota. I have a series coming out this year that's kind of a dragon-based epic fantasy, starting in April, and it'll be out one installment will be out every month until August. And that's entitled The Serpentine Throne. If you check me out on social, you'll notice that there's some links to that. But the book that I'm showcasing for the festival is The Muse of Winter, and I think somebody has already won one of these little things. And this is an original fairy tale. It has been compared to The Snow Queen, but it's really more about seasons and change and music. So I write mostly fantasy with some romance, and then this is a little bit of an experiment, kind of speculative fairy tale-ish things. So that's what I do.
Great, thank you. Paula. Paula, you are muted.
It's gonna happen. There we go. My name is Paula Morhardt. I live in Northwest Illinois. I started out writing a memoir, so to speak, when my husband passed away unexpectedly, and that kind of leaped me into writing, which is something I've always wanted to do. I started writing books of poetry. I've discovered that I have a knack for writing children's book. My third, fourth, and fifth children's books are just getting ready to come out. I also have a series called Through the Garden Window. The first one is Through the Garden Window, Seasons of Harvest, and it is stories of little essays about the garden and the kitchen. And then I have recipes in there from my mother's, grandmother's, and great-grandmother's recipe boxes in their own handwriting. And then we also type them out because you can't read them very well. So that is the children's books has surprised me, but that's what I'm doing more of. So, and poetry.
Great, thank you. Terri.
Yeah, hi, I'm Terri Karsten. I write actually a lot of different things. My favorite thing to write is historical fiction, like for adults, like this Mistake of Consequences, my debut novel. But recently, the last year, I did more children's work. This one is a Japanese folktale, retold folktale that I learned from when I was in Japan. But my favorite thing to write is historical fiction. I've been writing since I was about 7 years old. So it's part of who I am.
Awesome. Kathryn.
I'm Katherine Sullivan. I'm in Winona, Minnesota. I tend to write more short story collection, both fantasy and science fiction, middle grade fantasy. I've got another one coming out. The sequel to this is going to be coming out whenever my publisher gets around to it. Children's picture book. I tend to write more fantasy and science fiction. I haven't quite settled on one or the other. Like Terri, I started writing when I was young, but I was 14 when I started writing.
Great, thank you. Jason.
Thanks for having me. I write and illustrate comics and graphic novels. Most recent is a trilogy that just wrapped up this year called Last Pick. There's book 1, there's book 2, and there's book 3. I'm also a special education teacher for 22 years now, so most of my storytelling relates in some way to people labeled with disabilities. This young adult series I just finished is about people labeled with disabilities fighting back and sort of saving the day against aliens. Very sci-fi, very disability very much advocating for people with disabilities.
Great. All right, thanks. Joy.
Hi everyone, I'm Joy Riggs. I live in Northfield, Minnesota. I have one book featured here, Crackerjack Bands and Hometown Boosters, Story of a Minnesota Music Man. Came out in the summer of 2019. It's a book of memoir and biography about my great-grandfather, who was a real-life music man and was influential in Minnesota's strong tradition of music and community and school bands, and my kind of quest to find out more about him. I'm a journalism was my background, so write primarily just nonfiction, write a lot of essays about parenting and travel and history. Those are kind of my main interests. And I'm not working on another book at the moment, but still doing a lot of writing. And like a couple of people have said, just have been writing all my life really, and also reading. And I think the two, go hand in hand.
Great, thank you. Jim.
My name's Jim Landwer. I live in Waukesha, Wisconsin, just outside of Milwaukee. I used to live in St. Paul, so I'm just happy to be here amongst the brethren here. But I write mainly memoir and poetry. And my latest book, Cretin Boy, came out in 2020, and it's about Cretin High School, the Catholic all-male military school I went to in the 70s. It's my third memoir. The first was Dirty Shirt, which is about the Boundary Waters canoe area and funny stories about going up there with my brothers and my kids later. And then my other one is called The Portland House, and it's about the house I grew up in St. Paul, Minnesota, and just funny stories with that. My mom was a single parent with 6 kids. She raised us in that house, so it's got a lot of funny stories. But yeah, I'm glad to be here. Thank you.
Thanks. We're glad you're all here too. Julie, finish this up.
I'm Julie Holmes. I am the author of Murder in Plain Sight, right there. I've been writing all my life. I prefer to write, or at least what I write right now is mystery, generally traditional mystery, a lot of it suspense tossed in. I have written sci-fi, I have written epic fantasy, and on my list of next things to do is I've got an urban fantasy that keeps bugging me, so I'll have to address that at some point. Right now I'm working on book 2 with the main characters from Murder in Plain Sight.
Great, awesome. Well, thanks everybody for being here. Like we said, the topic is kind of your guilty pleasure reading. Maybe just a few of you want to share what when you hear guilty pleasure reading, what does that mean to you? We'll kind of define what we're going to be talking about first. Terry, I saw you unmute. Do you have a
Sure.
definition you want to share with us?
So when I think of guilty pleasure, I was an English teacher for 22 years, and I'm supposed to like the classics and stuff with heavy themes, and I actually do like that, but guilty pleasures would be the things that the English teachers don't assign. So the lighter stuff, the stuff that's more fun, I guess would be what I would define it as.
Sure. Anybody else? Julie?
I would define a guilty pleasure reading as something that's out of my genre. So I'm not reading to learn how other writers do it. It's not a craft book. It's not, as Terry said, heavy. It's something that's fun. It's something I could probably consume in a couple of days, and it's just fun. Make me laugh.
Great, thank you. Paula?
Growing up on a farm in the Midwest, my favorite things have nothing to do with farming or the Midwest or anything like that. So those are kind of my guilty pleasures there. And I agree with everyone else too. It's the fun books, the things that you can't skim through them, but you can just sit and have a good time while you're reading. It has nothing to do with what you normally write.
You're reading and all of a sudden it's, an hour past dinner time or whatever, and you should probably continue on with your day.
Or 3 in the morning, yeah.
That too. Anybody else want to share kind of your idea of a guilty pleasure read? Kathryn, yeah.
Well, I write science fiction and fantasy, but in my previous life, I was a university librarian. So my guilty pleasure has been reading mysteries that librarians are the main characters, actually solving mysteries. And I love the Magical Cat series because she's got magical cats and she's solving mysteries and she's a librarian. So it's wonderful.
Yeah, Jason.
Yeah, I'll start by being a little bit of a killjoy, and then I'll go to my guilty pleasure and say that the history of comics, like those have been persecuted forever as being like destroying youth, and just recently they're introduced into the classroom. So I have a little pushback against anything being a guilty pleasure. Like if you enjoy it, there's no guilt, especially for reading. I really do it. But that said, I think my definition of a guilty pleasure is anything I'm reading that I have to explain to someone why I like it might qualify as a guilty pleasure.
I like that. Yeah.
That's
Yeah,
a great
good.
explanation.
Awesome, great. Well, before we kind of really dive into that, kind of when you, okay, so you've got your guilty pleasure reads, but what kind of books do you find yourself reading that you would consider work or more connected with being an author? There again, just a few of you want to share. You know, are you reading, you know, how to write books? Are you reading books in your genre? What types of things do you classify as reading for work? Susan.
I can go. Well, presently I'm reading this gem, developmental editing. So that's definitely work. I have a lot of other books laying around here that I don't have as handy, but around advertising, marketing, social media, anything about craft. I read The Heroine's Journey recently and did a lot of comparison with The Hero's Journey because, you know, writing fantasy, they're actually two, and I was surprised. I learned a lot by reading that book. So lots of things on craft, lots of things on the marketing side of being an author. And then I also consider reading other authors that are in my genre or close to my genre as part of my work, because I have a pretty strong feeling that networking and sharing with other authors in your own genre is a strong way to build your knowledge, yourself, as well as your presence in the author community. So
Great, thank you. Paula.
I find myself reading cookbooks because I need to compare the recipes from the late 1800s and early 1900s that my grandmother and great grandmother wrote as to what is out there now. And so I'm reading the cookbooks and I enjoy reading the cookbooks, but it's still part of work.
A little bit of both worlds. So.
Yes.
Terry, and then we'll go to Jim after Terry.
Just to jump on what Paula was saying, I also read cookbooks. A little bit older, I read them from the colonial period and medieval period, and then I try to use the recipes from them and make the stuff that there. So it's definitely work, but it's quite pleasurable to try to figure out, you know, what did they really mean by that?
Yeah, go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, I would have to say that the magazine, I actually read the Sun magazine, which is a great magazine. There's no ads in it. It's all memoir, a little bit of poetry, but it's just beautiful stories and tragic stories of people's lives. And as a memoirist, I think it helps me become a better writer. From a craft standpoint, there's a book out there by Bill Knauer called Write Within Yourself, that is just another beautifully crafted book on the writing process, and just a real knowledgeable guy. He also has a blog, but just some great poignant parts about writing for the love of it and not necessarily for the money or the audience even. And then I'd go as far as to say, you know, whatever I want is a guilty pleasure. You know, I read, like Jason said, you shouldn't consider it a guilty pleasure because I just love to do it. I don't care what I'm reading. It's just something I do. It's part of my being.
Okay. When I was working on my book, I was reading a lot of narrative nonfiction, like Eric Larson's books, David Grann's books, looking a lot at structure and looking a lot at how writers incorporate history and craft in telling true stories, and also looking a lot at memoirs. And then during the pandemic, I completely have been reading, kind of pivoted to, I was working on an essay about my grandmother who loved Agatha Christie books. And so I totally got into Agatha Christie books and I hadn't read them since junior high. And so normally do not read mysteries at all. And so it's been a really fun change, and have looked at them both as a reader, but also now as an author, looking back at you know, what she does with her craft. And it's kind of made me think, what other genres have I just kind of put aside because I've, you know, I'm always looking at the kind of writing that I do, and it's been really fun. So I think it's, when you think about guilty pleasures, it's kind of fun to think about, well, you know, why do I limit myself at all? There's all kinds of things I might be missing because I just think, oh, I don't read that, I read this. But like, if it's good writing and it's a fun story and it keeps you up at night, I mean, that's what it's all about.
Great. Anybody else? Julie? Yeah,
Yep.
go ahead.
Well, craft books, obviously, especially books by Donald Moss. Donald Moss is wonderful for explaining craft and showing examples. And I also read other authors in my genre, mystery authors. In fact, I can think of 2 or 3 of them I've just read where reading as a writer, noticing how the book is, the story is structured, how the plot is structured. So even though it's enjoyable, it's also, you know, reading as a writer, it's almost hard to go back to just reading because you're looking at how other authors do it.
Yeah, Kathryn.
I usually present at young writers conferences, so what I will usually do is read how to write books by young adult authors geared toward the younger writers, mainly so I can pick up maybe 10 techniques, but it's also because I can recommend those books to the particular young 6th and 7th graders who are interested in learning how to write. Here's another good book. You don't have to wait just on websites.
Jason?
Yeah, Julie said something that made me, I try to avoid reading comics and graphic novels when I'm trying to be really creative, because I kind of do what Julie said. I focus on, you know, how they're doing and comparing myself to it. And I can think that can be a sort of an insular world that's not helpful. So when my reading for work is reading like traditional prose fiction. That's where I'm learning about, you know, how other people are telling stories. And it's a little more disconnected from the work I'm doing, and it helps me grow as a writer.
Great. All right, we'll do a quick show of hands and realizing, okay, you know, maybe pandemic has changed your reading habits, but kind of thinking back over the last, we'll go over the last year. How many guilty pleasure books have you read? So kind of show of hands, over 5 books. All right, that's kind of what I expected. Okay, more than 10 books, you know, average 1 a month. 15. We'll go with, let's see, 24 books, 2 books a month. All right, so anybody have an estimate of how many books you read kind of in a month? You 1 a week?
About
3 a week?
about 4 books in a month, 4
Okay.
to 5. They're not all guilty pleasure ones, but they're about 4 or 5 books in a month.
Oh,
A mix.
you're about a
All
book
depends
these
on what
days.
I'm on how much I need to write. If I'm writing, I tend to read a lot less.
Mhm.
I read probably 2 to 3 books a week, guilty pleasure, but it's because I read so fast, and I read, and I won't let myself read until I've written so many pages or I've done so much stuff. So it helps me with my writing because I have to do the work before I get my fun time.
The motivation, I like it. All right. So yeah, just share what types of books, what genres you're reading, what are your guilty pleasure go-tos, or your reading for enjoyment, if we're going to avoid the guilty pleasure title.
I read a lot of cozy mysteries, historical cozy mysteries. Yeah, I read everything, but that's what I really go-to for my, okay, I'm going to relax now.
Paula, go ahead.
I read everything except romance novels. I will not read romance novels, but I read just about everything else. So yeah, it's and it's nothing for me to have 3 or 4 books going. I might have one up here and one in the living room and one in the kitchen and one in the bathroom, and I've got several going from all different genres. So yeah, that's definitely my guilty pleasure is reading.
Just in general. Kathryn.
I've been doing a lot more comfort reading, which means a lot of rereadings. So when the pandemic first started off, I was rereading all the Murderbot Diaries by Marsha Wells, where you've got this android robot construct who really doesn't want to worry about humans. It just wants to watch soap operas. I love that series. And I also started rereading all of C.J. Cherry's Foreigner series because it's all diplomats working with alien races. It's like, and that was about 24 books in that series. So I had to reread the entire thing from the beginning. So I'm doing a lot of comfort rereading.
Mm-hmm.
Julie, I think, did you have? Go ahead, Julie.
Yeah, my comfort reads. I like that. Kathryn. I haven't done. Actually, I did, but I read urban fantasy. Yeah, especially urban fantasy with humor and snark and all that other fun stuff. So, and I for the very first time, I read an urban fantasy series, and for the very first time ever, I immediately turned around and reread it, the whole series, because I just enjoyed it that much. So.
Susan, did you have something?
Yeah, I would say that probably my guiltiest pleasure, back to Jason's definition of something you have to explain why you're going to read it, is some kind of gritty romance. But one of the real comforting things that I like to read is YA fantasy. So that's probably like Cassandra Clare, the Mortal Instruments stuff. All of that is, I could just devour those. I think I read the first trilogy in a weekend, and they're easy reads. They're just kind of candy. I call them candy.
Jim, you saw your hand?
Yeah, I've taken to reading mysteries, oddly enough. The one who got me into it was William Kent Kruger. And it's something about the mystery set in Minnesota that just pulled me in. And he does just a fabulous job at description. And, if you do bad description, it's tiresome, but his is not. It's just beautifully sets a scene. And so that led me into another author, Jeff Nanya from Wisconsin, who wrote a book called Figure Eight about muskie fishing at a cabin, but it's a murder mystery. And it's kind of a William Kent Kruger wannabe, but it's okay. It just wasn't the same caliber. But both of them are just like really interesting, because I would never have thought of myself as a mystery reader, but they write so well, it just pulls you in, and the setting is really appealing.
Joy.
Like Jim said, I've been reading more mysteries, or explained to Agatha Christie, which has been great fun. And I discovered there's a podcast called All About Agatha, where these two people talk about the books. And I don't really listen to a lot of podcasts, but this has been a fun way to kind of combine this interest that I've had. And then the other thing, since it is the Deep Valley Book Festival, I have to put a plug in for Maud Hurt Lovelace. And this kind of goes to the comfort reading. Sometimes I like to read some of the books that really inspired me to be a writer when I was a kid. And so I just absolutely love the Betsy Tacy series. I grew up with that. Books like Ketty Woodlawn and Anne of Green Gables. Sometimes I'll go back and read some of those, and just, yeah, it's makes me feel good.
I liked Kathryn's comfort reads. Or show of hands, do you reread books a lot, or even some? I know some people are like, I don't reread books, but yeah, a lot of some rereaders and some not. So yeah.
I have one series that I can reread. That's a lot.
Which one is that?
It is Jacqueline Carey's Cushiel series. Here's the first book. This is my favorite of all time. So this is the one. These are the ones I can reread. They are definitely guilty pleasure, but They're also really well done as far as characterization go and epic fantasy.
Mhm.
Jason, did I see your hand up?
Yeah. Comics. Well, I feel like we should turn into a drinking game anytime I say comics, but it is a little early. But anyway, comics. I think I typically read sort of the more thoughtful adult graphic novels, but it's meaning I don't read a lot of superheroes. So superheroes have become my guilty pleasure for sure. And I'm gonna do tons of plugs for graphic novels. I'll try to space it out, but WandaVision, if anyone out there is watching WandaVision right now, Vision had a graphic novel series, comic book series that came out recently. New York Times calls it a comic book masterpiece. You can't argue with that. It's amazing. It's basically about Vision starting his own robot family and how he's persecuted, and it's great. And another one I'm going to push is The Immortal Hulk for teens and older. It's a really, it's written like a horror comic. It's actually very scary, very violent, and really well written. So those are two plugs I'll do up front.
There you go. Jim, I think somebody was wondering the Wisconsin mystery that you mentioned.
Mhm.
Somebody in the chat was wondering who that was
Who
again.
the author was.
Jeff Nania, Nania. He wrote a book called Figure Eight and another one called Spider Lake. And it's funny because I'm a muskie fisherman. You use a figure eight to catch a muskie, but I also caught a muskie on Spider Lake. So it's that kind of drew me in. But yeah, all good stuff on set in a local setting, which makes it appealing to me.
That's fun. Yeah, I saw some conversations in the chat as well. Audiobooks. So kind of, what types of formats do you read? We were talking Kindles earlier. Or are you strictly give me just the paper? What formats are your people reading? Are you reading or listening to, or any combination?
I'll go. I separate my writing and editing work from my reading by keeping my reading off of electronic devices for the most part. So I will read audiobook, or I will listen to audiobooks. I consider that reading too, because you get the whole story. And I will only read paperbacks or hardbacks, usually when I'm going for pleasure. If I'm doing a beta read for somebody else or something like that, I will sometimes do it on electronic, but I prefer to do most of my external reading on audio or paperback.
I would normally have said, just even a year ago, I would have said only hardback or soft cover, no electronics, but then I got my Kindle. And so I've got a ton of books downstairs on my shelves, but I have a ton of books on my Kindle. I do listen to audiobooks when I work seasonal, and it's about a 45-minute drive back and forth to work. And so I will listen to audiobooks on that drive. Otherwise, no, I don't. I get so caught up in a book when I'm reading it. It's not safe for me to be listening.
Kathryn, I saw your hand.
No, I'm still kind of a Luddite. I won't listen to an audiobook. The closest I come to an audiobook, though, are the Big Finish Doctor Who adventures, because they have the actual actors and they have sound effects. So that I can listen to. Unfortunately, my mother taught us how to read by reading aloud to us, and that always puts me to sleep. So I'll stick with the Big Finish audio adventures.
Anybody else want to chime in?
Joy,
and then Julie.
I only listen to audiobooks when I'm on a long car drive or ride, and I don't go anywhere right now. So I don't think to listen to audiobooks when I'm around the house. But there is a difference too. There's some audiobooks are so good because of who's doing the narration. And so I do enjoy one that's really well done. And then in terms of reading, I don't read electronically. I don't have a Kindle. Maybe Paula will get there like you do, but for now, I read physical copies of books and collect way too many of them. But of the things to collect, I think.
Oh, come on, can you have too many books?
No, I don't think so.
I would say all of us say there's no such thing. Julie.
I typically will try to read in paper simply because I don't have to worry about the battery going dead. but I only have so much space for paper, and sometimes the library doesn't have the books. I've turned to getting books from the library because then I don't have to store them. I just bring them back and let somebody else store them. So it's kind of half and half, paper and electronic, but I listen to audiobooks when I try to multitask when I am on the treadmill or if I'm going for a run. That way I can read the books that I should read that book. Well, then I can read it while I'm running or on the treadmill. But like driving, yeah, Paula, I can't listen if I'm driving. I get too caught up.
Yeah, when I listen to them while I'm driving, pretty much exclusively driving, because if I'm not listening to them, I'm so busy, I get so caught up in my own fantasy world of whatever I'm thinking about writing, that's unsafe. Whereas I can sort of still pay attention to the road if I'm listening to somebody else's fantasies.
I agree with that.
A question, does anybody put, are any of your books out as audiobooks, or are you thinking about it or anything that way? Julie, you said yours is?
Mine is, that was, and the audiobook publisher managed to get the audiobook released 2 weeks after my paper, the paper book was released. So yeah, so mine is on audio.
Mine's not on audiobook, but we're working right now, publisher's working right now to make a podcast series with like sound effects, full cast and all that. So that's going to be a lot of fun, hopefully.
Sounds like fun.
My most recent publisher put me in touch with a guy who does audiobook transcribing, and it just, his prices were just too high. And it was just like, I was like, okay, how many books do I have to sell to break even? And as much as I'd like it out there on audiobooks, I just can't justify it. And, that's what small press does to you. It kind of puts a lot on the author.
I actually, if you do ACX audio or through Audible, you can get a royalty share deal with some narrators. So if you're really wanting to get your book on audio, that may be something to check out. I did that with my first series. I got super lucky. It was a straight revenue share deal. So I get 50%, he gets 50%, but he did a phenomenal job on my audiobook. I couldn't have asked for better if I had paid thousands and thousands of dollars. I did get a quote on one of my other novels, and it is a very expensive deal to get your audio rights paid up front, so you actually own the book. It can be for like an 80,000 word book. It can be in the nature of $3,500 to $4,000, and that's mid range. That's not at that real high range. So there's a lot of considerations. If you're making constant sales on it, typically you're gonna do better, or you're gonna be in a better position to do an audiobook. If your sales are kind of ebb and flow, it might be something you don't want to consider until you have consistent sales.
Anybody gonna narrate your own audiobook?
Oh no, please don't. Has anybody listened to an audiobook where the narrator narrated it? I've only found one that was actually good.
The Frank McCourt has done his memoir of Angela's Ashes, and his voice is perfect for it. So he does a really good job of narrating his own book. But
it's nice. I won't pick up a book that's been narrated by the author normally. The only one that I did was Neil Gaiman's Norse mythology. That was good.
Oh yeah, his voice is also really, really good, very professional.
Yep. But he's also a trained actor as well.
Michelle Obama narrated her own book, Becoming, and I thought she also did a good job. So there are people who can narrate their own books quite well. I'm not one of them.
I would anticipate that a memoir is easier to narrate yourself than a fiction book. And the fiction ones that I've seen are, I feel like the authors get and my editor tells me this too, I feel like the authors get a little too invested, and it's not a consistent voice throughout. You get really excited at certain points, and so you hear that in the voice of the author if you're trying to narrate your own.
All right. Yeah, so why don't you share what are you currently reading? Anybody, like, are you mid-book? Anybody mid-book of a pleasure read that they want to share, or not share because it's not, not one that you want people to know that you're reading? I don't know.
I'll jump in just because Susan mentioned it really quick. Neil Gaiman is, I'm rereading his whole Sandman graphic novel comic series, which is like a decade's worth of work. And I've got these massive hardback books that, hurt my stomach when I'm laying in bed doing them. But it's great. Really holds up for the most part, and loving every bit of it.
Paula, I think I saw your hand up.
Yeah, I'm rereading my favorite author right now because I got him on my Kindle, and I am reading The Silver Griffin by Mercedes Lackey because I absolutely love that whole series. So I splurged and bought all of the books to put on my Kindle, so now I can read them again. Of course, I also have them down on the shelf. So.
I just have been rereading Lindsay Davis, Marcus Didius Falco historical mystery series. I've read most of them, but I found one I hadn't read. So it's the Jupiter Myth. I just love it. He's such a great character in ancient Rome. It's so much fun.
Jim.
Yeah, I just finished A Tree Grows in Brooklyn by Betty Smith, and it was my wife recommended it. She's read it a couple of times, and it's on our Kindle. So I was like, I don't typically, exchange books with her, and I just loved it. And it's a coming of age story about a little girl, and I thought this is nothing I would normally read. And it was just such a uniquely written book with the stylistically. I was just like fascinated by it. So I would consider that a kind of a guilty accident because I'll probably reread it at some point, but it was really just well written. My wife said too, there's nothing better than discovering a new author who has 10 books and you're like, yay, so.
Oh yes, Kathryn.
I just finished reading Shirley and Steve Miller's latest chapbook in the Layden universe, and I've started I'm gonna mangle her name. She's done the Thief series, and the newest one is Return of the Thief by Megan Whalen Turner, and snatched me right in last night. It's like, okay, yep. It's been a year since I read the previous books, but it's still a good series.
Julie.
Right now I'm in the middle of, I've never read the author before, but it's a urban fantasy. Title is Fire. It's the first of the Elemental series by L.B. Gilbert. And so that, yeah, it's good. I like it. I'm halfway through. So after that, I'm debating whether to go to another urban fantasy just for fun, or do I go back to work and read mysteries?
Reading a Wrinkle
the
in
decision
Time.
What to read next.
Yeah,
Sorry,
I
Susan?
think coming to the end of the book, because then you have to figure out what you're going to do next.
I'm actually rereading A Wrinkle in Time. This is one I haven't reread, or I haven't read in so long that I normally don't reread, but
That's a
when
good
I'm
book.
rereading.
Yeah, I just finished up the Lillian Jackson Braun, the whole series of Cat Who books.
Oh,
and
yeah.
that is a very guilty pleasure because they have absolutely nothing to do with anything. But I love to read them, and I can go through a book a day practically if I'm not doing anything else. So
Awesome. Yeah, and those in the chat too, feel free to put in your current reads too. Always fun to, you never know, might stumble across some new genres or whatever. I like what Jim was saying, kind of the accidental pleasure read. Have any of you come, it's like, okay, I'll read this. I've had 3 people now tell me I need to read this. I don't really want to, but then, halfway in, you can't put it down. Any books like that anybody wants to share? Terry.
Yes, so my sons read more fantasy or urban fantasy than I read. And they always tell me, Mom, you got to read this. Well, if they give it to me, then I'm obligated to read it. And the Dresden Files, I think it's Jim Butcher has done those. And I found I really liked them. So it's definitely an urban fantasy. I would not have picked it up otherwise. But, you know, sometimes if you listen to your kids, they're right.
You guys saw you got a thumbs up from Susan on that one.
Oh yeah, that
Oh,
one's
Julie
great.
too.
The other one is Kevin Hearn's
Hearn.
Iron Druid series.
The Iron
Oh
Druid
yeah,
series.
they
Yep.
had me read one of those too.
Yep.
Those are hilarious.
Have you read Ilona Andrews, the Kate Daniels series?
I haven't.
I haven't read that one, no.
Try that one. That's the series I had to go back and reread right away.
Oh, fun.
I also like
Mason, you would probably like the Kevin Hearn if you haven't read him. Very comic book, fun, focus.
the Andrews.
I'm writing it down.
Been great too. The whole idea of these inns basically sprout and reach into world gates. It's like, okay, I like this. And you look at vampires in a different way. Okay.
I was really late to the Magician's trilogy, Lev Grossman.
That one's great too.
My buddy had cancer, and he kept pushing. I was like, he's got cancer. I got to read the book. So I finally did it, and so fun.
I know somebody had a question on to define urban fantasy. I think maybe it was answered in the chat a little bit too. But
to define urban
fantasy? Like what is an urban fantasy book?
Urban fantasy is basically taking everyday our world and injecting anything that's injecting magic, injecting supernatural. For instance, the Supernatural series on TV, that would be considered urban fantasy, where you got your werewolves, you got your vampires, you got all that stuff, but it's in today's world, as opposed to J.R. Tolkien or Terry Brooks, where that would be considered epic fantasy.
Great. All right. Anybody else want to share what you're currently reading and enjoying? All right. What about your to read books? Anything on your to read pile that you're just like, no, I have to, kind of like Paula and her motivation. I got to get through this first, and then I'm picking that one up.
That list is so long, I don't even know where to begin.
Say, maybe your list is too big. You can't pick one.
I'm looking for some good ideas on that because I'm kind of between books at the moment.
I like I said, I read a lot of different books, and I am looking forward to rereading my Louisa May Alcott, the older books, A Rose in Bloom, Eight Cousins, things like that, because those are really good books. They're well written, and they're fun. They're a lot of fun to read. Those are some of my reward books again.
I loved Little Men when I was growing up.
Yes.
And then I read everything that she ever wrote.
Yes. Jack and Jill is good.
Yeah. Eight Cousins was always good too.
Yes. And
Lots
Rose
of-
and Bloom.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, lots of good ideas in the chat. They're flying in there. So if anybody's looking, check it all out.
Yeah.
Any other kind of to read piles or anything like that anybody wants to share?
I'm trying to read one of every author in our Twin Cities chapter of Sisters in Crime. Almost everybody's an author. So I'm trying to read at least one book from everybody. And I don't know that I'm even halfway through, and I've probably read 20 books. So
that's great.
That's on my list of books to read.
So what about series versus individual? Do you have a preference? Do you like, give me a book with 10 books in the series, or I just want a novel. I just want one, one central story, and then I can move on to something new.
I always say that I like a single thing. I was like, oh, it needs to be on its own. But I'm always really happy when I know there's another one coming if I liked it. I think an example was The City We Became. I really loved that book this year, and it definitely leaves off where, well, anyway, I like that there's a possibility of something else beyond it.
She
Terri,
typically writes in K. Jemisin typically writes in trilogies, so I would guess that there's going to be 3, and that is my favorite as a trilogy.
Mhm.
3
know
books
from the beginning where it's, how many it's going to be. Terri?
Yeah, I was saying too, I like that idea of the series, but sometimes series writers go past where the story is good. And so it's the same, it ends up being the same story over and over again. So I really like the characters, but if we were just reading the same story, it's not as nice. So I'm like that. I like the idea of the trilogy. I also I've been trying to read a lot of independent writers, independently published writers to support indie writers more. Harder to find their books though.
Jim?
Yeah, my wife has read the Harry Potter series entirely a couple of times. And for years, until this year, I did not read any Harry Potter. So I thought I'm going to read the first book and maybe I'll get into it. And it just wasn't for me. And I was like, does that make me a bad person? But I was looking forward to getting into the whole series. It just didn't catch me. So, but then I'll read William Kent Kruger's. I'm working my way through his books, and it's a series, but now he's got This Tender Land and that a couple other outside that series books. And it's just like a kind of refreshing to see something different from the same guy. I agree with Jason that one.
That's interesting, Jim. I'm a fantasy writer, and I could not get into reading Harry Potter either. One of the things that I think is the challenge, because my husband read it, my kids read it, they all read it, and I've watched all the movies, and I love the story. But it was the first books they follow the movie so much, one, and they are very simple to read, so I lost interest. I think that is the reason that I couldn't get into it. But
she said that the books grow up with the kids, so they get a little harder to read, which that's what I kept stumbling with. Is it seemed like it was written so basic, and I was like, it just doesn't catch me. But maybe I didn't give it enough try.
But it caught the kids, right? And if you have kids at that age, then you're probably going to read it too. I think that it's a challenge. It's a way to put it out there to get both kids and parents involved. My kids were past that age when I picked it up, but I had watched 3 or 4 of the movies at that time.
That was true of the book Twilight too. The year Twilight came out, a bunch of critics said it was terrible, but I swear that every single 10th grader in the school where I taught read it, boys and girls. Started out, the girls were passing it around almost secretly, and then the boys picked it up, and everybody read it. And that was it was a school without a lot of strong readers. So, so I had to read it too. All my students are reading it.
Yeah, I don't care what anybody says about that. That's a successful series.
Yeah.
It may not be the most clean writing in the world, but it did its job.
It got people to read.
Got people reading.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think we're kind of getting down a little bit on time. So before we get we've got a few books to give away this time, but kind of one final question. Your top #1 guilty pleasure read and or author. We'll give you that. So kind of think of what's your #1 on your list, whether you'll read it again or not. But Susan, why don't we just start, kind of go around the room on this? She's got hers ready.
Jacqueline and Carrie, I already shared it.
All right, Paula, put you on the spot.
Mercedes Lackey and Anne McCaffrey are tied for me, and Anne and I share a birthday, so what can I say?
Right.
Terri?
I have to go with Diane Gabaldon with the Outlander series.
All right. Kathryn?
Donna Andrews, mystery writer, but she has a bird in every single title, and I'm a bird owner, so, and the whole stories are hysterical.
I'm making my way through that the audiobooks. I'm yeah, big fan of audiobooks and have been enjoying those myself. So. Jason.
Again, no guilt, no guilt. Terry Moore's Strangers in Paradise. It's a comic book series that's lasted for almost 25 years off and on. A massive soap opera about two women, Katju and Francine, and their love life. And it's beautiful and wonderful, and I love it. And there's also like mobs and ninjas if you need that, which never hurts. So super fun.
Awesome. Joy.
I'm gonna stick with my current obsession, Agatha Christie, Dame Agatha. You can't beat her. She's amazing.
Awesome. Jim.
I'm going to go old school with Kurt Vonnegut, and I've read all of his books. I love his dark humor. And second, I guess, would be kind of Richard Brodigan. His poetry and prose is just so quirky. It's just, I can't read enough of it. But all of those books I've revisited. So,
Julie.
I can't pick just one, sorry. It's Jim Butcher and Ilona Andrews. It used to be just Jim Butcher, but after I read the Kate Daniels series, I have to add Ilona Andrews in there.
That's all right. We'll let you pick a couple. Authors, thank you for being here, and I need to refresh myself on what our next session is. That will be mystery writing with Chris Norbury. So the ins and outs of mystery writing, that will be at 2:30. I think the waiting room will open at about 2. So yeah, check that out. You can still register for that on the website. And again, just thank everybody for being here, and happy reading, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you,
Here, everyone.
Danelle.
Thank you.
Thank you.
thanks, everyone.